Welcome back to Dead Reckoning. I'm Brian Mattson. This is Jay Friesen.
Hi, Brian.
Hi. And today, in our Above the Paygrade segment, we're going to talk about a topic that I'm quite ignorant of, and so we definitely need an Above the Paygrade. So what I've decided to do, Jay, is bring onto the show the world's biggest college football fan. No, that's actually not a joke. This is the world's biggest college football fan, but he also happens to know a lot about money and finance. With us today on Dead Reckoning is Mr. David Bahnsen. He is the director of the Bahnsen Group at Morgan Stanley, coming to us from Southern California. David, welcome to the show.
Well, thank you for having me. Much appreciated.
So, how is USC going to do this year?
It's going to be a rough year, but we're righting the ship, fixing what needs to be fixed, and we'll have a new head coach next year, and looking forward to our return to glory, which is inevitable.
Sounds like you and the Minnesota Twins, man.
Yeah, right, yeah. Return to glory is inevitable. David, you wrote a piece recently that really struck me, and it was your reflections on the 5-year anniversary of the collapse of Lehman Brothers. And some of this is very technical. I still don't know that the technical aspects of what happened in 2008 have really seeped into our culture. And I don't know that it's really widely known. You were very profoundly affected, I think, by the collapse of Lehman Brothers. Can you, in just a few sentences, try to describe, just for our audience, what a monumental event that was and what that means for the global economy?
Certainly. Let me say first, though, as far as the technical aspects of what happened and the delay in those things getting into the consciousness of the American people, we're in between 80 and 85 years since the onset of the Great Depression, and we still largely have no clue what really technically caused and drove a lot of that. So I don't expect that a better specific and granular understanding of the Lehman collapse is forthcoming either. But I do think that there are larger and more ideological principles that can be understood. There's also a other narrative that is being understood. It just happens to be a false one, and maybe we'll talk about that. But as far as what exactly did take place 5 years ago now, we sit here in late September, early October, which is exactly that kind of point 5 years ago, where within a few weeks, Lehman Brothers declared bankruptcy. Because that happened first, it's largely considered to be the cause, where I would argue it just happens to have been a domino that went number one, but it could have gone number 4. It wouldn't have mattered. Then from Lehman's collapse to AIG's bailout to Merrill Lynch's being absorbed by Bank of America to, and literally in a 2-week period, the entire American financial system drastically changing, all intertwined with what was taking place in the real economy, which was a collapse of our bubbled housing market, ultimately leading to the TARP legislation that passed and the economic recession that then ended up, of course, resulting in the stimulus package and all kinds of other political implications. But essentially, the big event that took place 5 years ago was Lehman Brothers bankruptcy filing, and Lehman Brothers bankruptcy filing was caused by the fact that they had a lot more debt than they did assets. But a lot of companies have more debt than assets. In Lehman's case, it was by the tune of 50-1, and the leverage blew them out.
That's absolutely incredible. 50-1.
You know, when I was in Denver, I was shopping for a home, and I had a sales guy, in all seriousness, look at me and say, well, we can actually take out a second or third mortgage on your first mortgage and lower the payments and make it interest only. So, you know, you're buying a $300,000 home and paying $600 a month on it. Massively upside down, but it sounded so attractive. And there's such if you don't have any sort of knowledge or education or experience in finances and what it takes to, not simply in a company remain profitable, but as a consumer, as somebody on Main Street sitting there going, okay, well, I've got this credit card, and I'm going to go out and buy all this stuff, or I've got this new home that I want. Well, I can afford those payments, but not real. You've got no concept of how badly this puts you in a financial position.
Well, tell us about that. I mean, there's the sob story, right, David? Wait a minute. It was all predatory lending, uneducated people, being sung a song and dance. I mean, how do you respond to that?
That sort of victimology is a big problem in our society. It's a really big problem in explanation of the crisis. I would like to know why the same graciousness could not be extended to Wall Street executives that just didn't know that 50-to-1 leverage was a bad idea. They saw everybody else doing it. It seemed to be working out really well in 2005's P&L. So why would they not do it? Of course, we wouldn't accept that. There are differences in financial sophistication and things like that, but it's a very slippery slope to say that somebody signing a piece of paper they know to have dishonest information on it, that they're not ethically responsible for that. But even apart from those things, what we call liar loans, which were a big part of it, there's also just sort of the basic responsibility factor. When someone is refinancing to get a lower rate, and they're doing so to lower payment, there's nothing wrong with that. The wrongness comes in when they decide to walk away from that payment because the underlying asset declined in value. The greatest lie about the financial crisis that nobody, left or right, Wall Street or Main Street, government or private sector, that nobody is unaware of, is that people were walking away because they lost their jobs. There was only one reason people walked away from homes. It's because their house value declined below the point at what they owed on the home. It was just a strategic decision to say, I'm now paying on a debt of $500,000 and the mortgage is $400,000 or something like that. The systemic problem in the housing market was not caused because people ran out of liquidity to make a payment or ran out of monthly to make a payment. And the interest rate thing verifies this. The Fed went to the lowest rates in history in late 2008, and it still carries here today, but 9, 10, 11, and those were the years in which all the foreclosures and walkaways took place. They were not walking away because the interest rate rose and left them with a payment higher than they could afford. It was just purely an understanding, and you could argue that it was a sensible thing to do, but I would still say we have to call a spade a spade. People walked away because they just basically were underwater on a home and decided to not be faithful to that obligation.
Okay, so you're hurting my feelings. I mean, I love America. I love Main Street. I love the American. I love the American people. I'm taking the devil's advocate. I'm like somebody, our listener might. Now you're saying, David, that fundamentally one of the driving factors of the 2008 crisis is a moral failure, a failure in character in the American people. We had tons of people who had a legal obligation, a financial obligation, who walked away. Now this is difficult
Brian,
because.
Let me interrupt real quick on something there, because it's actually the most important thing that I could say as to why we live in a reasonably functional economy right now instead of one that fully collapsed. I am saying that there was a moral failure on the part of people who walked away from homes, but I'm saying that was limited to roughly 10% of the population. If it had been 20% of the population, it's game over. There would not have been an ability by the government to attempt to reliquefy or reflate. So yes, it is true that 10%'s walking away initiated a chain reaction that was catastrophic in our economy, but 10% is a number that our economy was able to absorb. 20% would not have been. So I choose to being a glass is half full guy. In this case, I'd be a glass is 90% full. There are 50% at one point, 50% of people who were underwater on their mortgages, and only 20% of those walked away. So 10% of the American people. I actually think that's a credit to the American moral fiber in one sense, but that 10% would have been unspeakable in prior generations, including in the Great Depression, where the number one thing that people said was Americans pay. So what you're saying
is the third villain in the room
is us. Yeah.
Yeah, I am saying that. I'm saying that the villainry, by the way, is the same trait across the other culprits. There's just more zeros involved with Lehman Brothers, but what was driving the poor balance sheet management of Lehman Brothers was rank covetousness, and what was driving the individual homeowner decisions across Main Street was rank covetousness. I suppose some people had higher taste than others, but I think it's morally all the same thing.
Wow. So, and in the piece, and we're going to put this, we'll put a link to your essay up on our show notes. I really like the way you described this. You said, look, in any kind of criminal enterprise, you've got a manufacturer, you've got a distributor, and you've got addicts. And it seems like everybody wants to talk about the manufacturer, whether it's Fannie, Freddie, Fed policy, whatever, or they want to blame the distributor, Wall Street. But nobody wants to talk about the fact that, you know what, you have no problem if you don't have addicts. And that's kind of your thesis. The American people were addicts to over-leveraging themselves. And getting in debt.
I think, Brian, that analogy is very good, but I guess I'd even be a little more gracious to real drug addicts. At least at the end of the day, the real drug addict is dealing with a tragic chemical dependency. The dealers and peddlers and distributors are all driven only with a greed and profit motive. But in this case, the addict is also driven by the greed and profit motive. And I don't mean the good kind of profits. I mean the ill-gotten gain kind. And so what you have here is, yes, manufacturers driven, I think, by a moral infirmity, but also everybody in the food chain, including the end user, who was the borrower. I'm not referring to a person borrowing for a mortgage is not the problem. But the person borrowing for a home they can't afford without the moral resolve to pay out on the obligation when times get rough, doing so in ways that pretty much an elementary school student knows are irresponsible, and also doing so for the purpose of a keep up with the Joneses type of lifestyle and motivation. So that in that case, the addict analogy works, but I think that the home ownership addict was worse than the narcotic addict, who at least, in fairness, has a sort of medical issue at play, not purely a 10th Commandment problem.
That is such a brilliant analogy, though. I love it.
Yeah, it's really fantastic. So David, the problem with your analysis here is that you can't just pass a law to fix it. I mean, you can't just tinker, with Dodd-Frank and, have a little more regulation. Mm-hmm. The problem is you are identifying a cultural problem. What do we do about that?
Yeah, there's a lot of specific in the whole process we've been talking about today. A lot of specific things that took place leading up to 2008 and so forth that can and should be addressed. For the most part, the most sensible addressing of things will be done and ought to be done with market solutions. For one thing, the cult of home ownership, this doesn't address the cultural problem of greed and covetousness, but the national obsession with home ownership, it could be addressed if we allowed it to revert to market forces. The government does not stimulate or force people to participate in other activities in the marketplace, and we don't generally end up with bubbles in those activities. But the two things that I've seen that the government has subsidized and stimulated that then have resulted in debt bubbles are college admissions and homeownership. Yeah. And so we have a $1.1 trillion student debt problem. And I can promise you that is not going to be paid back. And we had the homeownership fiasco. The greatest thing that can happen for a generational solution as opposed to a mere policy solution would be a resurgence of traditional family values that views a home as a place to raise a family and not as a trading card. The way in which we view homes or houses is a direct byproduct of what we think of the concept of home, which I consider to be synonymous with a family. So I think that over time, the need for a refresher in family as a key building block in our culture will be paramount to avoiding a future housing crisis. If there's no crisis of the home, there's no housing crisis. That part is as simple a synopsis as I could give going forward.
Wow.
And it's absolutely brilliant, David Bahnsen. We appreciate you coming on the show today, and hope to have you on again in the future. Go Trojans, I guess. I'm not a college football fan, but we appreciate you coming on today.
Well, thanks so much for having me.
Thanks, David. And if you'd like to find out more about Dead Reckoning, visit our website, www.deadreckoning.tv. And catch the Spindle, where I actually talk a little bit about the issue of overinflated college prices.
Oh, fantastic.
Yep.
All right.
I'm Jay Friesen.
I'm Brian Mattson.
And this is Dead Reckoning.